swear I hit record. Alright, this is going to be a video for my drive to the testing center, because tomorrow I'm taking the SSCP exam. It's about an hour drive, so I'm going to be going over my notes. I'll start with risk. Just know that to get a risk, there has to be a threat and a vulnerability. So threat plus vulnerability equals risk. Remember that a quantitative risk assessment uses the following formulas. Single loss expectancy is equal to asset value times exposure factor. To get your annualized loss expectancy, you have to multiply your annualized rate of occurrence by single loss expectancy. Risk tolerance is, or risk appetite, is the level of risk that is willing to accept. An organization is willing to accept without taking any action on it. Risk registers are centralized documents used to track information about the risks facing an organization and their current status. They contain a description of each risk and a categorization scheme, a risk assessment, and risk mitigation actions. Remember that IOCs are indicators of compromise. These are telltale signs of malicious activity. Remember there are three major approaches to threat identification: asset focused, threat focused, and service focused. Remember the difference between internal audits, external audits, and third-party audits. The only ones that are kind of hard to remember is just knowing that external audits are performed by an outside auditing firm, and then similarly, third-party audits are conducted by or on behalf of another organization, such as a regulator. So third-party audits would probably be like regulatory audits. And then external audits are just, say if you hired your own auditing firm to come in and audit you, just to gauge your own compliance. Remember there's types of reports, two types of reports that are involved with audits, type 1 and type 2. Type 1 reports provide a description of the controls in place and described by the audited organization, and the auditor's opinion whether the controls described are sufficient. The auditor does not test the controls. So the only difference between type 1 and type 2 is type 2, the auditor actually tests the controls. So he documents engagements where the auditor actually tested and the controls, and provides an opinion on their effectiveness. So type 1, they just get an opinion on it, and then type 2, they actually test the controls. Remember that COBIT, ISO 27001, and ISO 27002 are commonly used standards for cybersecurity audits. Remember that regression testing is checking for unexpected side effects of software changes. Remember that fuzz testing is modifying inputs to an application to detect unexpected behavior. Remember SCAP. SCAP is the Security Content Automation Protocol. It provides a standard framework for vulnerability assessment, and it includes the following components: CVE, CVSS, CCE, CPE, XCCDF. That's just vulnerability scanning stuff. Remember that in vulnerability management lifecycle, there's three basic steps: detection, remediation, and validation. Know that in penetration testing, it goes beyond vulnerability scanning and attempts to exploit vulnerabilities, and it includes 5 steps. The planning goes to information gathering and discovery, which goes to vulnerability scanning, which then goes to exploitation, and then reporting. Remember that syslog provides a standardized mechanism for the transmission of log events, often used to send to the SIEM. Remember that in criminal investigations that evidence must be so compelling that it is beyond a reasonable doubt standard of proof, since the penalties are so high. Remember the best evidence rule, which states that when using a document as evidence, the original document must be used unless there are exceptional circumstances. So, best evidence rule is original documents. Remember the parole evidence rule? Parole. It states that a written agreement is assumed to be the complete agreement. So, this basically says any non-written alterations to this agreement are considered not valid in a court of law. Remember that a honeypot and a honey net, these are just like types of decoys used to catch attackers or distract attackers. Honeypot kind of serves to deploy as decoy systems, and then a honey net is a decoy network. Remember that differential backup copies all files on a system that have changed since the most recent full backup, while incremental backup copies all files on the system that have changed since the most recent full or incremental backup. Remember that the Diffie-Hellman algorithm is used for secure exchange of symmetric keys. Remember that to improve the security of cryptographic algorithms, increase the key length, which increases the key strength by making it more resilient against brute force attacks. Remember that transport layer security, TLS, is a replacement for secure socket layer, so SSL is the predecessor. And TLS uses public key cryptography to exchange a shared secret key used to secure web traffic and other network communications. Remember the Trusted Computing Base, TCB? It's the secure core of a system that is a secure perimeter with access enforced by a reference monitor. Remember that WEP is now insecure. Remember that WPA is also considered insecure. The original WPA, that is. It uses Temporal Key Integrity Protocol, TKIP. And remember that WPA2 is secure, still considered secure, and it uses the CCM mode protocol, which is abbreviated as CCMP. Remember that digital certificates use the X.509 standard? Remember those two methods to revoke certificates after they've been issued? The older method being the certificate revocation list, CRL, and the more modern technique being the OCSP, Online Certification Status Protocol. Remember there are three different types of validation that can be issued with a certificate. The weakest being domain validation, where the CA only verifies that the certificate subject controls the domain name. So this is the weakest form of validation. The next one would be organization validation. This is where the CA verifies the name of the business purchasing the certificate in addition to domain ownership. So this does the first one as well, but also verifies that the business name. The most validated would be extended validation, EV. It's where the CA performs additional checks to verify the physical presence of the organization at a registered address. Remember that blockchain technology uses encryption to create an immutable distributed ledger that supports cryptocurrency and other emerging applications. Remember that data minimization is the practice of only collecting data that is necessary for legitimate purposes. Remember that trademarks protect words and symbols, copyrights protect creative works, patents protect inventions, and trade secrets require maintaining secrecy but don't expire like the others. In the OSI model, just make sure you remember that that in the network layer and the data link layer, the data is still in form of packets. Remember the TCP three-way handshake to establish a connection. First, the client will send to the server a sign flag, and then the server will send back a sign ACK flag, and then the client will finally send back a final ACK flag. Remember that ARP converts between MAC addresses and IP addresses. Remember WPA2 and WPA3 are considered secure in what should be used today. WEP, WEP, and WPA are considered insecure today. Remember that enterprise wireless networks use the Extensible Authentication Protocol, EAP, to implement authentication for wireless clients using the organization's identity and access management system. Remember network time protocol was 123. Remember SNMP goes over port 161 or 162. SQL Server is 1433. The rest of these are probably irrelevant. Remember that VPNs use either TLS or IPsec to form their encrypted tunnels. IPsec uses authentication headers, AH, to provide authentication, integrity, and non-repudiation. And they also use encapsulating security payload, ESP, to provide confidentiality. So that's IPsec. Remember that demilitarized zone is essentially a screen subnet on a firewall. It's where you would put your public-facing equipment, such as website servers. Remember that software-defined networking separates the network control plane from the data plane, allowing networks to be dynamically reprogrammed. Storage-defined networking allows the extension of the firewall zone model to create very small zones for specific types of devices in a strategy known as microsegmentation. Remember there's two types of VPNs. There's either a split tunnel or a full tunnel. I kind of remember this one now, but I'll say it anyways. Split tunnel only sends traffic destined for the corporate network through the VPN tunnel, while full tunnel sends all traffic through the VPN, regardless of its destination. Most security professionals advise against using split tunnel VPNs and just playing it safe and using full tunnel. Full tunnel is slower though. Remember that CDNs take load off of your web servers. Basically, content delivery networks work very well against your DDoS attacks because they cache your website or whatever you got on it. So all these requests aren't going through you, and they're going through these CDNs. Remember that salting passwords with a random value prior to hashing reduces the effectiveness of rainbow table attacks. Remember that replay attacks use stolen authentication credentials to take over a legitimate user's abandoned session. Remember that DNS poisoning attacks seek to redirect legitimate traffic by inserting false DNS records into a DNS server. Alright, remember that viruses depend on user action to spread, while worms no user action required. Everything else in here. Rootkits, just remember they elevate privileges of a normal user to gain admin rights. Backdoors are just an unauthorized mechanism for accessing a system. Remember the difference between signature detection and heuristic detection. Signature detection is great for detecting known vulnerabilities, known viruses and malware, while heuristic is behavior-based. So while it results in more false positives, it's better at detecting zero-day vulnerabilities. Remember that EDR platforms provide a consistent, consolidated solution for detecting, containing, and responding to endpoint security events. Also, code repositories. They provide collaborative development tools and version controls. Remember that code signing is just using digital signatures to demonstrate the authenticity of a code, mostly for those users who install it on their systems. Remember that the word multi-tenancy just means when it refers to cloud computing, it means that many different customers may simultaneously use the same shared platform. Remember that block storage provides virtual disk volumes for use by virtual machines, while object storage is less expensive and allows us to store files as individual objects but can't be directly mounted by an operating system. Kind of iffy on that. I don't remember going over that. Remember VPCs? That's just virtual private clouds. They're similar to VLANs on a physical network, but just network segmentation through the cloud. Remember that interoperability is the desire for compatibility of services between cloud service providers. Remember that portability is the ability to move workloads between providers with minimal effort. Flip the page. Remember that there's a hypervisor that's responsible for enforcing isolation in a virtualized environment, and there's two types of hypervisors. There's a type 1 hypervisor. It's also known as bare metal hypervisor, where the hypervisor runs directly on the physical hardware. Type 2 hypervisor, the host operating system runs on the physical hardware, and then the hypervisor runs on top of the operating system. You can control access to cloud resources through the use of network security groups, which implement firewall-like functionality. Cloud orchestration, when you think of orchestration, when you see orchestration, think of automation. It allows the automation of administrative tasks, including the creation of workloads, assignment of permissions, and provisioning of accounts. This builds upon the concept of infrastructure as code. I know the cloud types. Remember that federal government agencies require that services they use be certified under the Common Criteria and CC, and that encryption used to support them be compliant with FIPS 140-2. A few more things on this page is service level requirements, the SLR document. It specifies requirements that a customer has about any aspect of a vendor's service performance. You already know what an SLA is. Remember that Memorandum of Understanding, MOU, are used to document relationships in a less formal manner compared to an SLA. Another one is Business Partnership Agreement. It just documents the parameters of a business partnership. Last acronym on this page is Master Service Agreements, MSA. It's used to create umbrella relationships with specific engagements documented in statements of work that refer to the MSA. So master service agreements, when you think of master, think of umbrella terms. So umbrella relationships. Alright, some other written notes I got here are the data lifecycle. It follows a life cycle of create, store, use, share, archive, and destroy. Like I said earlier, to say that already, went over that. Remember that in incident response, the highest priority of a first responder is containing damage through isolation. Remember the sanitation techniques for sanitizing like hard drives and disk. Clearing overwrites sensitive info, which frustrates casual analysis. Purging uses more advanced techniques to frustrate lab analysis, and destroying completely obliterates. It's the best form of data sanitation. Remember the NIST incident response process? It involves first preparation, preparing for an incident, and then you go to detection and analysis, which is just trying to discover or prevent, discover or diagnose a incident. Then it would go to containment, eradication, and recovery. After you complete the step, you would go back to detection and analysis to see if you detect any more signs of an incident. And then if it's all clear, you rotate to post-incident activity. Remember that when collecting evidence and digital forensics, you should collect all the most volatile evidence first, such as memory and running processes, and then move towards things like disk drives. Remember that recovery service level is the percentage of a service that must be available during a disaster. Remember that Cat5 can support up to 100 megabytes per second of transfer rate. Remember that Cat5e and Cat6 are capable of 1,000 megabits, so a gig. And then remember Cat6a and Cat7 are capable of 10 gigabytes per second. Remember capacitance motion detectors monitor the electromagnetic field of an area to detect people. Remember that business continuity members, which is their dedicated function, should receive refresher training at the minimum of annually, so once a year. Remember the fire extinguisher classifications. This is important for like data centers. Remember that Class A is for ordinary combustibles, Class B is for liquids or gases, and then Class C is really important. It's for electric fires, which you would probably experience most in like data centers and with highly valuable equipment. You probably want to minimize the damage. And Class D is just for metals. Remember in disaster recovery planning or business continuity planning, a parallel test is just when a disaster recovery site is activated for testing, but the primary site remains operational. A full interruption test is where you completely simulate shutting down the first site and having the second one kick back in. Remember that a bastion host is a secure log server. Remember that salting is used to frustrate the use of rainbow tables already. Remember that proximity cards have an electromagnetic coil inside them. So if you see an image with an electromagnetic coil, that's probably a proximity card. Remember the symmetric encryption algorithms such as DES, 3DES, AES, Blowfish, Twofish, RC4. And then remember the asymmetric algorithms such as RSA, RGP, ECC. ECC actually is an encryption algorithm. Well, yes it is. I didn't write in here whether or not it's asymmetric though. Just remember that ECC doesn't use prime numbers like other algorithms. So it's less vulnerable to quantum computing developments. Quantum computing is just something that could break all our algorithms as time goes on, just because as processing power gets better, our key lengths become less protective of our information. Diffie-Hellman, I kind of went over this earlier. It solves for the problem of key exchange for symmetric encryption by providing a method of sharing a private secret key without actually sending the key across the internet. Remember that key escrow allows government access to encryption keys. It's not yet reasonable. There's not yet a reasonable way to implement it. They tried to do the Clipper chip, which is like a government backdoor, but it failed. Key stretching. It adds strength to an encryption key by salting and hashing. You should stretch a key several times. Remember the different type of hashes. MD5, it's no longer secure. SHA-123. There's also RIPE-MD. It's an alternative to government-sponsored hash functions. Remember HMAC, which is hash-based message authentication code. It combines symmetric cryptography and hashing, and it provides authentication and integrity. Remember that certificate stapling attaches a stapled certificate, preventing a request for every user. There's types of different certificates that you can get from a certificate authority, such as a root certificate, which protects the CA's private key. There's wildcard certificates, which covers an entire domain. There's I already went over the 3 different types of verification that comes with certificates, the DV, OV, and EV. And I already said that X.509 governs certificates, so I wrote some things down twice here. Digital certificates allow for the secure exchange of public keys, obviously since it offers integrity through validation. TLS is a protocol that uses other encryption and hashing functions known as cipher suites. Therefore, something can't be encrypted by TLS, but you can use TLS to use other encryption algorithms. Remember that session keys are also known as ephemeral keys. SSL is the predecessor to TLS. I know that. This is now we're going to touch on IP security, IPsec. It's an Internet Protocol security. It's a set of protocols designed to add security capabilities to the TCP/IP model. IPsec uses 2 protocols to protect data. I went over this earlier: encapsulating security payload (ESP) and authentication headers (AH). So remember that IPsec uses ESP and AH. ESP and AH. Remember that IPsec can be used to support VPNs in 2 different ways. Site-to-site VPNs, which is something like building-to-building, encrypting tunnels to connect 2 networks together. It's also known as tunnel mode. And then also it can support end-user VPNs, which is just if you're trying to remote into the corporate network for individual systems. It's also known as transport mode. The only difference between HTTP and HTTPS is obviously it's a secure version of HTTP, but it's secured by using TLS. The same thing for Telnet versus SSH. TLS is just added to the protocol to make it secure. So essentially any secure version of a common protocol probably uses TLS to secure it. Remember that TFTP is not encrypted or secure. Also remember that instead of encrypting emails at the network layer using protocols, you can also encrypt them at the application layer using the SMIME protocol. Make sure if you're trying to ensure the integrity of your DNS records, use DNSSEC to add digital signatures to DNS. Remember that LDAPs offers a secure version of LDAP. Remember that DKIM provides email authentication by allowing mail servers to digitally sign legit outbound email messages. Remember that Tor is just that it just facilitates anonymous internet connection. It also enables access to the dark web, which is a software package that uses encryption and relay nodes to facilitate anonymous internet access. Remember this one, PFS, which is perfect forward secrecy. it hides nodes identities from each other. Birthday attack, that one's kind of easy. Attacker finds two inputs with the same hash value. Remember that asymmetric encryption is always slower than symmetric. Remember the definition of entropy. It reduces the predictability of cryptographic methods. Remember that downgrade attacks are just removing or weakening the encryption. Here's one good one. Remember that NetBIOS works on 137, 138, or 139. Parents remember all those. Remember that ICMP is the Internet Control Message Protocol. It's the housekeeping protocol of the Internet. It allows functionality of like ping and traceroute, or traceroute, sorry. Remember the difference between stateless and stateful routers and firewalls? While stateless is when a device does not pay attention to the connection state and it evaluates each packet separately. So that, for example, a firewall would evaluate each packet separately if it was stateless. If it was stateful, it would perform stateful inspection, which monitors connection status and follows or allow or deny rules. Remember that on firewalls and access control lists, implicit deny is essentially if something isn't explicitly allowed, deny it by default. Next-gen firewalls, they incorporate contextual info into the decision-making process. Remember that proxy servers just make decisions or make connections on behalf of someone, usually the client. And a reverse proxy is kind of like the exact opposite of that, where the server has the proxy make connections and requests on the server's counts on the server's behalf to the client. Remember that a transparent proxy works with the client or the server without the client or server's knowledge, and it does not work well with TLS. Remember that proxies can handle many applications, not just web servers. Remember with load balancing, the term round robin load balancing just means that all the requests are distributed upon the servers equally. Remember that VPNs require a VPN endpoint that accept VPN connections, such as a dedicated VPN concentrator or firewalls or routers that have built-in functionality. Remember that for the site-to-site VPN, you would use IPsec. For remote access, you would use TLS VPN. And then if you want to do VPN within your web browser, you would use HTML5 VPN. That one should be easy to remember. Remember the two different deployment modes of a intrusion prevention system. There's inline and in-band deployment. There's inline in-band deployment, where an IPS sits in the path of network communications and can block suspicious traffic from ever entering the network. So in-band stops it from ever entering your network. While out-of-band, which is also known as passive deployment, is where it connects to a span port on a switch and can react after suspicious traffic has entered the network. Remember that CDNs take a load off your server by caching your service and distributing it. I went over that earlier. CDNs provide on-demand scaling, cost efficiency, locality of content, and security enhancements, protecting against DDoS attacks. Remember that the private IP ranges start with 10.0.0.1. Remember that, and 172.0.0.1 and 192.0.0.1. Remember the difference between east to west traffic and north to south traffic? Essentially, east to west traffic is network traffic between systems and a data center. So in the same network, traffic moving around in the same network. North to south traffic is data moving around from, say, a data center on to the network, to the internet, So it's leaving your network. Remember that to enable VLANs, the admin must enable VLAN trunking and assign switch ports to desired VLAN. Remember that you should usually put proxy servers and content filters in the DMZ, as well as SSL accelerators and load balancers. SSL accelerators handle the difficult cryptographic work of setting up TLS connections. That's an important one to remember. Remember Radius and TACAS Plus? They provide centralized approaches for authentication, authorization, and accounting. Radius is usually used with an application server, while Cisco proprietary uses TACAS Plus. So TACAS Plus is Cisco proprietary. Remember promiscuous rules is when more rules are allowed than necessary. And then remember orphan rules, access is allowed to decommission systems and services, so they've been abandoned. Remember that routers have access control lists, and standard access control lists perform filtering based on source IP address. Extended access control lists provide block traffic based on more advanced criteria. Utilizing ACLs on routers reduces the load of the firewall. Remember VLAN pruning? That's when you limit the unnecessary exposure of VLANs by limiting the number of switches where they are trunked. Deny the use of auto VLAN trunk negotiation, this will prevent VLAN hopping. So deny the use of auto VLAN trunk negotiation. It's wonderful. DHCP snooping, it blocks the malicious DHCP traffic. Remember to use spanning tree protocol to prevent routing loops. And remember to use BDPU guard to protect against spanning tree protocol attacks. SNMP, talked about that earlier, it automates routine network monitoring and management tasks. Remember that a jump box allows admin connections between different security zones. Or whatever, wireless encryption. The important one is WPA2 and WPA3. WPA2 uses AES encryption and CCMP, while WPA3 uses CCMP and SAE, which is simultaneous authentication of equals. Domain hijacking is an attack when an attacker gains control of an organization's domain registration. ARP poisoning, it's the spoofing of ARP addresses. I already know everything about malware. Remember the hacking groups, such as hacktivists. It's hackers seeking to use skills to support political agenda. Organized crime, think of financial gain. They're hacking for financial gain. And the nation state actors is hacking usually highly sophisticated APTs that are hacked to benefit a nation's interest. APTs are just well-funded and highly skilled hackers that are typically government-sponsored and have access to some 0 days and other sophisticated weapons. Defending against APTs is kind of hard because APTs often have access to unpublished 0 days, like I said. Remember, spear phishing is targeted phishing attacks. Remember, whaling is a version of spear phishing, usually used on big-time executives. Remember that farming is the use of fake websites, and that pretexting impersonates a consumer. Alright, cross-site scripting. That occurs when an attacker embeds malicious scripts in a third-party website that are later run by innocent visitors of that website. Cross-site request forgery. It's attacks that leverages the fact that users are often logged into multiple sites at the same time and uses one site to trick the browser into sending malicious requests to another without the user's knowledge. Server-side request forgery is pretty much the same thing, but it targets the servers rather than the users. Remember that cookies, browser cookies track user activity across the web, and that one flaw of cookies is they use an easily guessable authentication value, making vulnerable to session hijacking. Cookies should always be sent encrypted across the network. Remember that the hardware security module manages encryption keys and performs encryption decryption tasks. So an example of an HSM is a TPM module. Remember what a heartbeat sensor is? Essentially, it just sends alerts from a system that it is still online or goes offline. Remember that polymorphic viruses mutate, or they morph, each time they infect a system. This makes it very hard to eradicate because the malware evolves from system to system. Remember the Mirai malware? It just targets IoT devices. And that is all I got for tonight.